Hey everyone, so last day we left off, we completed Periphery and we went through their life cycle. And so the next group is phylum Cnidaria. So basically there are three classes here. So this is, when we look at this, I want you to make sure that you understand that we're talking about class. So remember that, kingdom, phylum, class. I guess if we put domain up at the top, right? Main, kingdom, phylum, class. All right, so three classes. So we've got class Hydrozoa, all right, and so this is that, if you go back to your mystery protist, I gave you this, it's not a protist, but I gave you this mystery organism which you had to try and figure out, and that was a Hydra. I'll show you a picture in just a second. Cyphozoa, so class Cyphozoa. So if you can remember this as jellyfish, and then Anthozoa, which is your sea anemones. So I always try to remember Anthozoa, sea class. Antha starts with an A, and so anemone starts with an A. One way, and then the Hydra is really easy, Hydrozoa, right? And zoa is that sort of root ending that basically means animal, right? Like when we talk about zooplankton, that sort of thing. Okay, so their symmetry and movement is, for the most part, they are radially symmetrical, right? So this means they're kind of symmetrical around a point. So we think of like pieces of a pizza, right? Wedges. They can be solitary or mobile. So they both, like, remember sea anemones we saw last day, the swimming enemy, but they can also anchor themselves. Of course, jellyfish are mobile, right? Um, but they have two different body plans, and that's what's shown here. So this first one is what we refer to as a polyp. So this includes mainly your sea anemones, right? That has this sort of polyp body plan where this is where they'd be anchored to some substrate, or the Hydra have this kind of body plan, with the tentacles kind of up on the top. The body plan to the right is what we call the Medusa, or what is like a bell shape, right? And so that's this piece, and the tentacles come down, right? So those are the sort of what we call two main body plans. Now, we've got the development of tissues starting to happen. So we've got two tissue layers. We've got so those two tissue layers include the epidermis. So that's kind of this outer layer of tissue, right? And if we think about here, this outer layer, and then we have the gastrodermis. So this is a layer lining what's called the gastrovascular cavity, which is kind of their pseudo-stomach. So between these two layers is sandwiched what's called a mesoglia, right? And so you can see that here, maybe if I erase some of this stuff, but you can see the mesoglia here. So in blue, you see this ectoderm, and then the gastrodermis in green, and then the mesoglia here in pink. All right, and these two germ layers lead to a tissue level of organization, creating some body systems. So we'll see here coming up. So specifically, the feeding and digestion. So if you're a cnidarian, like a jellyfish, you have what's called a gastrovascular cavity. So this is an important, star this, highlight it, but you have a gastrovascular cavity, and this consists of a mouth and a hollow gut, but we say digestion is two-way. This is what I was talking about last week. So the mouth, you can see, is down here on this jellyfish. So basically, food goes into this gastrovascular cavity and it just sits there. It's not like us where food goes in and it keeps traveling one direction and eventually makes its way out as feces, out our large intestine, rectum, and anus. Here, they have a gastrovascular cavity. Food goes in and waste comes back out the same way. So we say it's two-way because food and waste travel in and out same opening, in a sense, the mouth. All right. Now, what's special about these guys is their name comes from cnidarian, comes from their mechanisms of capturing prey, which are these tiny cells called cnidocytes, or also referred to as nematocysts. So these are cells with coiled, hollowed threads, and I think I have, maybe not. Yeah, so here we can see the nucleus of the cell. So this right here is one of those cells, and you can see it sort of before the discharge, and you can see the word nematocysts. So they have these tiny little nematocysts which have these harpoon-like structures which can trigger capturing of prey, right? So let's just jump back up. So very important with respect to feeding and digestion, right? Cnidocytes to help trap, capture, neutralize prey, and then ingest it into their mouth. Circulation and respiration. Now, they have no specialization here, so no specialization. So it's essentially diffusion. So when you think about these things, they don't travel very fast for very long. Very slow moving because they have to rely on diffusion, which is very inefficient, right? No respiratory system, no circulatory system, nervous and response. So they do have this kind of what's called a nerve net, right? And so this is a very simple nervous system that is like a diffuse web throughout the tissue. With interconnected nerve cells. They have no brain, right? No concentration of nerve tissue, just a nerve net that basically coordinates movement, right? So complex activities of the body, including movement and also for feeding, right? So that's about all the nervous and tissue is responsible for. Now, as far as reproduction, so Hydra can reproduce sexually by producing testes or ovaries in the body wall, but they do not enter the life cycle with a medusa, right? Instead, the sperm and egg will combine to form a polyp, right? So that's just basically like a small version of, kind of a small version like this, but in sexual reproduction. So if we look down here, you can see here you have asexual reproduction in which it can just produce a bud, kind of like yeast, but it can also produce eggs and sperm, which fertilize together, forming this planula, which will grow into a polyp. So there you have sexual reproduction, but you have asexual through budding, right? And that happens similarly with the jellyfish as well. Okay, so when conditions are favorable, Hydra will reproduce by budding. And of course, favorable, when there's lots of nutrients, lots of space and habitat, then asexual is fast and quick, right? And so you can reproduce lots in good times, but then in harsher times, you rely on sexual reproduction. That creates genetic diversity, but it's a little bit more slower and less chance of success, right? Because you're broadcasting these eggs and sperm out into the aquatic environment, so less chance of them meeting, right? So with asexual, either a piece will break off and form a separate animal, which is termed, in this case, fragmentation, right? In yeast, we call it budding, but fragmentation, same, very similar. And the animal will reproduce by budding. Budding. So fragmentation, a small piece can break off and grow into a new animal. Budding, you can see down here, an actual kind of copy of a smaller version of the adult grows off the side, and then that breaks off and it detaches and grows into its own polyp. During sexual reproduction, separate sexes, male and female, produce sperm and egg. Sperm and egg are broadcast into water, and it's external fertilization. So external fertilization. So think of the obvious, like us, we do internal fertilization, right? Sperm is deposited inside the female. Here, it's external because both sperm and egg are broadcast into the water, right? And they fertilize outside of either specimen. And the zygote grows into a free-swimming larvae, which eventually attaches to a surface, forming a polyp. So like the picture shows below. All right, so that's basically our cnidarians covered. Here's some structures. Sorry, my mouse is all over the place on the fritz. But there's some of those important structures and designs. And if we talk about ecological roles, well, many of these things make up coral reefs. So they provide shelter, habitats, microecosystems, well, everything from large-scale ecosystems in coral reefs to smaller scale microecosystems and habitats. They can be food, sources of symbiotic relationships. Think of your clownfish, Nemo, and his sea anemone, so symbiotic relationships. All of these proving to be ecological roles, right? So some of these symbiotic relationships can be with fish, some of them can be with algae, so remember plants, right? But animals with other animals and so on. And so in the case of algae, right, they can photosynthesize, so they can provide sugars for the animal, right? And the animal may provide some sort of protection. And that's it for cnidarians.